The Zodiac Killer.
Zodiac Killer.
He called himself the Zodiac Killer, a man who stalked lovers' lanes, shadowy highways, and quiet neighborhoods across Northern California in the late 1960s. His crimes shocked America not only for their brutality, but because he wanted the world to know. He wrote taunting letters to newspapers, filled with strange symbols and cryptic ciphers, daring police to catch him. In those letters, he claimed responsibility for murders and hinted at more victims no one could even confirm. The case became known as the Zodiac Killer, America's most famous unsolved serial murder case. Even today, more than half a century later, his identity remains a haunting mystery. Was he a faceless monster lurking in the night, or someone hiding in plain sight among neighbors and friends? It began suddenly. Teenage couples shot while sitting in parked cars, a cab driver gunned down in San Francisco, families attacked in broad daylight at a lakeside. The randomness terrified the public. Anyone could be a target. What made it worse was that the killer seemed to be watching, always one step ahead, feeding on fear itself. But the most chilling twist wasn't just the violence, it was the voice he left behind in ink. His confessions, his puzzles, his mocking tone. He forced the world to read his words, and by doing so, turned murder into a theater of terror. Who was he writing to? The police? The press? Or every ordinary American who opened a morning paper and saw his code staring back? The Zodiac Killer was more than a murderer. He was a manipulator of minds. Each cipher carried the threat that if people failed to solve it, more would die. That psychological game, part crime, part performance, made him unlike any killer the United States had ever known. And yet, despite decades of investigation, hundreds of suspects, and countless theories, his face was never revealed. The story of Zodiac is not just about death. It is about fear, obsession, and the human hunger for answers that never come. Don't look away, because the truth behind this case is darker than you can imagine. This is the beginning of the Zodiac Killer, America's most famous unsolved serial murder case. To understand why the Zodiac Killer left such a scar on America, we have to step back into the atmosphere of Northern California in the late 1960s. It was a time of transformation. San Francisco was the heart of the counterculture movement. Hippies in Golden Gate Park, protests against the Vietnam War, free love, and psychedelic music pouring from Haight-Ashbury. The Bay Area was alive with youthful energy, but underneath that freedom was also anxiety, political assassinations, racial tension, and the rise of new violence that no one could explain. Against this backdrop, the Zodiac struck. His first known attack came on December 20th, 1968, on a cold night in Benicia, a small town just north of San Francisco. High school students Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, had gone on their first date. They parked along Lake Herman Road, a quiet lover's lane. Moments later, both were dead, shot without mercy. For their families, the tragedy shattered ordinary lives. For the community, it was the beginning of terror. The following summer, July 4, 1969, another young couple sat in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Darlene Ferrin, 22, and Michael Majot, 19, were attacked by a man with a flashlight and a gun. Darlene died. Michael survived, though gravely wounded, and would later give police their first description of the killer. A stocky white man, around 30, with brown hair and glasses. But the Zodiac was not content with murder alone. Within days, letters arrived at 3 newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained a third of a cipher, promising that together they would reveal his identity. "This is the Zodiac speaking," the writer declared, a chilling signature that would become infamous. He demanded the ciphers be printed on the front pages, or more would die. The media complied. America was reading the words of a killer at the breakfast table. For investigators, the case was unlike anything they had seen. Killers usually hid from attention. This one craved it. He inserted himself into public life, demanding a stage. The police struggled with jurisdiction. Crimes spanned different counties, each with its own department. Coordination was slow, and Zodiac exploited it. Every time the public thought the nightmare might fade, Another letter arrived, dragging everyone back into fear. For the families of the victims, grief was compounded by spectacle. Betty Lou's parents faced reporters on their doorstep. Darlene's young daughter would grow up haunted by questions. David's relatives kept asking, why them? Why such innocent lives? And yet the killer seemed almost to erase the victims, turning attention onto himself. Beneath the headlines, something more sinister was growing. Zodiac wasn't just attacking people, he was attacking trust itself. Could anyone feel safe when even a quiet drive on a summer night could end in death? The Zodiac case grew darker with each attack. What once seemed like random killings of young couples now carried a disturbing signature. Investigators began to notice the cracks, details that revealed not only the violence, but the mind behind it. Survivors remembered a calm, almost detached voice, heavy breathing, and the sense that the killer was savoring the terror he created. He wasn't simply eliminating lives, he was orchestrating fear. On September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard relaxed by Lake Berryessa, a spot usually filled with sunshine and quiet. What should have been a peaceful afternoon turned into a nightmare. A man appeared wearing a black hood, his chest marked with a white cross circle symbol. He held them at gunpoint, tied their wrists with plastic clothesline, then attacked with a knife. Brian was stabbed 6 times, Cecilia 10. Before leaving, the killer scrawled on Brian's car door, a date, the weapons he used, and his name, Zodiac. Cecilia died 2 days later in the hospital. Brian survived, his testimony painting one of the clearest pictures of the killer. The case took a chilling turn only weeks later. On October 11, 1969, cab driver Paul Stein picked up a fare in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood. Minutes later, he was shot once in the head. Witnesses across the street, 3 teenagers, watched as the passenger wiped down the taxi and tore a bloody piece of Stein's shirt. That fragment later arrived in the San Francisco Chronicle's newsroom, mailed by the Zodiac as proof. The killer had struck in the heart of a major city, in plain view of children, and still escaped. Every act revealed something beyond the blood. The killer craved an audience. His letters arrived with maps, taunts, and new ciphers, mocking police for their failures. One message even threatened to attack a school bus, boasting that he could pick off children as they bounce off the bus. Phew! The terror was no longer confined to lovers' lanes or isolated roads. It reached into daily life, infecting the sense of safety of every parent and child. Detectives were torn. How many victims truly belonged to the Zodiac? Officially, 5 were confirmed dead and 2 survived. Yet in his letters, he claimed dozens. Did he exaggerate to feed his legend? Or was law enforcement missing more bodies? Lost among the chaos of late 1960s California, each possibility deepened the fear. Cracks also appeared in the investigation itself. Jurisdictions clashed. Vallejo police, Napa County sheriffs, San Francisco detectives, and the FBI all worked separately. Information slipped through gaps. Suspects were questioned and released, evidence mishandled. One man, Arthur Lee Allen, drew suspicion for years, yet nothing conclusive tied him to the crimes. For families of the victims, this confusion meant justice remained out of reach. Meanwhile, the letters never stopped. Zodiac laughed at the manhunt, boasting that police could not catch him. He even phoned the Vallejo Police Department after one attack, his voice calm, emotionless, giving details only the killer could know. It was a taunt that confirmed he was watching the chaos unfold. And beneath it all lay a deeper question. Was Zodiac acting alone, or was he a mirror of the times, a reflection of America's unrest, where assassinations, protests, and violence filled the headlines? Was he a single madman, or the product of a society that had begun to fracture? If someone had listened more carefully to his codes, if the warnings had been understood earlier, could lives have been saved? Or was Zodiac always destined to slip through the cracks of justice, leaving only fear and unanswered questions in his wake? The tragedy of the Zodiac case was not just in the murders themselves, but in how they unfolded, brazen, public, and relentless. Each crime tore deeper into the American psyche. Each letter dragged more people into his theater of fear. What began as isolated killings grew into a spectacle that left families broken and communities paralyzed. The randomness was its own form of terror. On December nights, teenagers were gunned down in parked cars. On summer evenings, couples were stabbed under open skies. In October, a taxi driver was murdered in the middle of a city street. The killer seemed to prove he could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. That unpredictability haunted every ordinary moment of life. The letters amplified the tragedy. Zodiac wrote as though he wanted his crimes to live forever. He described victims as if they were props in his performance. In one note, he bragged about the man in the park who had begged for his life. In another, he claimed to have enough slaves to serve him in the afterlife, reducing human lives to tokens in his twisted game. For the families, these words were daggers. Parents opened newspapers and found their children mocked by the man who had killed them. The media fed the storm. Headlines blared his cryptic codes. Citizens tried to solve them at kitchen tables, and amateur sleuths flooded police with tips. Every unsolved cipher became a national obsession. People began to see Zodiac everywhere. Neighbors, co-workers, even friends became subjects of suspicion. Fear was contagious, but tragedy also lay in missed chances. Police patrols had stopped a man resembling Zodiac near the scene of Paul Stein's murder, yet let him walk away after receiving the wrong description. Evidence that might have tied a suspect was lost or mishandled. Each mistake left the killer free to continue, each error compounding the grief of families who wanted justice. The victims themselves remind us of the real cost. Betty Lou and David, teenagers just beginning their lives. Darlene, a young mother whose child would grow up without her. Cecilia, who fought to survive but slipped away in a hospital bed. Paul Stein, simply working to support his family. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary cruelty. The tragedy was not only their deaths, but how quickly their names were overshadowed by the figure of Zodiac. He wanted the spotlight, and in many ways he stole it. Decades later, the world remembers his codes more than their laughter, his symbol more than their faces. That theft of memory of dignity is its own lasting wound. Half a century on, the tragedy endures because the case was never solved. Each unanswered question is a shadow. Each cipher that remains unsolved is a reminder of fear that once gripped California. And each anniversary brings families back to the same place, mourning without closure. There was no trial for the Zodiac Killer, no courtroom where he faced his victims' families, no jury to weigh guilt and innocence. That absence is part of what makes the story so haunting. Instead of a single reckoning, the fallout stretched over decades, through investigations, suspects, public theories, and endless frustration. By the early 1970s, police departments across Northern California were drowning in tips. Every strange neighbor, every loner, every eccentric became a possible Zodiac. Composite sketches were posted in stations and newspapers. One man, Arthur Lee Allen, emerged as a primary suspect. He lived in Vallejo, near several crime scenes. He had been fired from jobs, accused of disturbing behavior, and reportedly told friends he wanted to be called Zodiac. Police searched his home and found weapons, notes, and even a wristwatch with the same cross-circle symbol. For many detectives, Allen seemed the obvious answer, yet evidence never fit perfectly. Handwriting experts said Allen's script did not match the Zodiac's letters. His fingerprints did not align with those lifted from crime scenes. DNA testing, when technology later improved, failed to tie him to the case. He remained the most famous suspect but never charged. When Allen died in 1992, many feared the truth had died with him. Other names rose and fell. School teachers, journalists, military veterans, even ordinary fathers were accused by amateur sleuths. Families were torn apart by suspicion. In some cases, children grew up believing their parent might secretly have been Zodiac. Each accusation carried its own kind of devastation. The fallout also lived in the public's imagination. The unsolved ciphers became puzzles for generations. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally cracked the 340 cipher, which had taunted investigators for more than 50 years. But even that breakthrough gave no name. Only more of Zodiac's mocking words, claiming he was not afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise with his slaves. The cruelty of his voice echoed across decades. Media kept the fire alive. Movies, books, and television shows retold the story, often focusing more on suspects than victims. The Zodiac symbol became a pop culture image, appearing on posters, Halloween costumes, even tattoos. For the victims' families, this was another wound. Their loved ones' deaths turned into entertainment. Law enforcement itself bore scars. The case exposed failures of coordination, lost evidence, and missteps that haunted careers. Detectives were tired with regrets. Some admitted they had nightmares about letters they could never decode, faces they could never identify. For them, the fallout was personal, a lifelong sense of unfinished duty. And yet, even in its incompleteness, the Zodiac case left lessons. It showed how a killer could manipulate media, how fear could spread faster than bullets, and how obsession could consume both investigators and the public. The trial never came, but the reckoning has lasted for half a century. That even today, new evidence sometimes surfaces: a DNA test, a forgotten police report, a confession from someone who claims to know. Each time, hope rises. Each time, disappointment follows. The fallout is ongoing, as if the case refuses to end, keeping both truth and justice just out of reach. Half a century has passed, yet the shadow of the Zodiac Killer still lingers. The victims' names remain carved into history, but their families never received the justice they deserved. What endures is not only the mystery of his identity, but the feeling he left behind. A reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary faces and strike without warning. The case remains unsolved, and that absence of truth is its own wound. Each anniversary brings back grief for families. Each new theory revives hope that fades again. Investigators have retired, evidence has grown cold, yet the questions remain alive. Who was he? Why did he kill? And how could he escape for so long? The Zodiac Killer was never just one man. He became a symbol of fear, of manipulation, of how violence can ripple through time. He turned letters into weapons, fear into theater, and death into a spectacle that still grips imaginations today. But in the end, the story is not about him alone. It is about Betty Lou and David, Darlene and Michael, Cecilia and Brian, Paul Stein. Ordinary people whose lives were stolen, whose families were shattered. Remembering them is the only way to take back what Zodiac tried to steal: the dignity of the victims. So the question remains: in your heart, who is the Zodiac Killer? A faceless monster or a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature? If you want to discover another story of mystery and tragedy that shook America, don't miss the next video.